Okay, so now I've been given the OK sign by my director or by my mentor. I can now start going into sort of splining and I guess polishing. Now the first question that I was going to answer was really, when is the right time to say, okay, now let's go to spline? Well, there's two answers to that question, I think. The first answer is when you have enough information in your individual poses that tells the story and has all the information maybe with the feet and has the information with the cog and the chest. And that's a very mechanical answer to the question. When the shot is working, then you can go into splining. And that's a good answer. The second answer, which I think is equally, if not more important, is when your mentor or your director, whoever is in charge of the shot, has said, okay, I like this story, I like the posing, I like the timing, just basically finish the shot now. Just do it to completion. And when you have the go-ahead sign that you can just crack on and finish, that's when I would consider my splining to start. So what do I do in splining? Well, as you can see here, I'm really kind of focusing on now the limbs, the feet, the neck as well, and I'm getting the rest of the body working. This shot is a fairly simple sort of movement, so I don't need to do much to the feet. Making sure the push-off feels nice, the spacing and the arcs feel nice. And now I really am ignoring my reference. There's a couple of times when I do check to make sure I have the right angle of things, but overall I'm just using my understanding of force and my understanding of the animation principles just to make sure that things feel nice. I do see lots of students, they try to copy their reference too much and the animation feels a bit janky or strange because you're forgetting that this is not real life, this is animation. So this time just get the things working for your animation and you can move away from the reference now. So yeah, I'm going through the other foot now. I do use motion trails a lot. Maya's motion trails are not great, so there are plugins you can use like Animate, which do a better job, but it still does what I need it to do, and I do rely on them quite a lot. Now another question you may ask or be thinking is, how do I apply this workflow to like other shots? Like this is quite simple, like a step over. I just went down the chain with the rotate Z in my blocking pass. I then, did the neck, I did the arms, and it was kind of a straightforward shot with no major impacts or acting choices. But the answer is really, it's the same. Like any shot which is just a character moving around the room or having conversation or something which is just straight up body mechanics, which is not something really crazy like a fight scene, then I would probably use this workflow. The only thing to consider is what is the most important controller or curve that needs the most attention. And for this shot, it's clearly the cog and then the rotate Z. The overlap in that chest is really important to sell the believability of the shot and the weight. So that's what I spend my time on. If the character was picking something off the ground, or maybe landing after a jump, then rotate X, so the back and forth movement, will be a lot more important. So that's what I would spend my time on. But the workflow is the same. I work out what is important, and I focus on those things. Another really extreme example, maybe this is a close-up of someone picking up a cup of water or something. That way I really focus on the hands and the fingers and the rotation of those joints in the fingers, getting that overlap. You want to build that in. And even at this stage you can see I realised that my blocking for the feet were pretty bad. So I went in, I changed that up a little bit, made sure the spacing was correct. And I shifted the timing, made it snappier, made it faster. Because these are the things that you can change, but they don't change the story. They just change the mechanics of what's happening. So this is why you want to show these things in blocking, because this stuff will look really bad. Your director or mentor will comment on the feet and you won't get the correct notes. But now in spline, I can then fix those things and I can make sure it looks good for my splining animation. So that's the really important key difference between blocking and splining. This workflow also does work with acting. So if you're doing acting shots, especially if it's something subtle, you do the same thing. You open up your graph editor, you choose those curves that are important, you build in your overlap in your fingers, in your chest, in your shoulders. But yeah, it's the same thing. Most shots I do the same way. But here you see I'm going back up to the chest again and the cog. It's a back and forth process. And I have to go up to the neck. The neck is completely broken, as you can see. There's not much going on in the neck. The head as well. So I have to fix things. And it's a very iterative process, right? And I do spend a lot of time on this neck and this head because I realised my blocking was pretty bad. So I want to get this fixed for the spline pass. And the difference between spline and polish, for me, is very small. I guess you could really argue that it's just the controllers you're animating. So I would consider chest and the shoulders, they could be like your spline pass. But once you get past them to your fingers, your elbows, your neck, that's when I'm considering that the chest is done and I'm polishing the shot with the limbs and the hands. But I think there's a very clear difference between blocking and splining. But there's a very small difference between splining and polishing. So yeah, so now working on the neck a bit more, fixing these curves that are not broken. The actual workflow itself between splining and blocking is very similar. It's just how detailed I'm going. So I realize the neck rotations are wrong. Like this neck is completely broken. Like the curves are all over the place. There's no real smoothness. There's no real fluidity to the neck. And the orientation was also wrong. It was facing the wrong way. So trying to fix that. And I also spent a lot of time fixing this neck and I couldn't get it right. I was wondering why it was wrong. And I realized that this was because the chest was wrong. And even the cog was slightly wrong. So that's why it's really important to work from the bottom up. Start with your cog, go up the chain, because I thought the cog was correct at this point. I thought the cog was finished. And I realized it wasn't. And that meant my neck was not working. Because I was doing the curves correctly in the neck, but because the cog was wrong, my neck curves weren't working. So I thought maybe the neck's wrong, keep trying to change it, and is this right, is this right? And it kept snapping and popping, and it was really jarring to watch. And then I opened up my cog and I realized, look at these curves. There's something wrong. So here's a really good example of when, if you don't focus on your root or your cog controller first, and then go up the chain, you'll cause problems later on. And of course, this video, even as a time lapse, is a lot shorter than the first video, which I think is really important to comment on because your blocking should be the majority of your work. And I was a bit distracted doing this shot. I was busy with other stuff during the day, so I took my time on the polishing. But honestly, if I was a bit more focused, this polishing could have been done in, well, maybe 1 hour. Maybe 45 minutes. I was really, really trying. And that's not because I'm boasting, it's just because my blocking was done correctly. There's not really much to do in the splining. You're just basically hitting spline, checking all the curves, making sure everything's working perfectly, and then your polishing is adding in those nice head turns, maybe a blink, the fingers and overlapping, and I'll show you some tricks later just to make some things polish slightly more. But honestly, polishing and splining should be quite quick relative to your blocking. Another thing to remember is your shoulders. I didn't animate them very much in my first pass, but I realized I have to do a bit more. And your overlap should also be built into your shoulders as well. And all the rules that apply to the chest and the cog and the bouncing ball assignment, that applies to every controller. And the shoulders, they should bounce if there's a movement which is upward, so like a jump, the shoulders might drag down slightly, If you're landing, they drag behind the body, and they should have their own offset and their own drag. And I'm trying to work on that quite a lot in this section. And this is another good example of why I don't want to animate the translates, because I would have had to do this twice. But here with only the rotations, I can just focus on my rotate Z for the up and down of the shoulder. And because of the angle of the shot, the rotate X is very minimal. And then the rotate Y is quite important as well. But really, I have to really focus on just 2 controllers for this shoulder. I think in a minute I actually set the rotate X to 0 for the entire shot, just because I realized that this tiny animation is doing nothing for the shot. So I thought, well, just zero it out, make myself sort of have less work. And it's another example of how I've found ways to make my work very quicker. Just animate what you need to animate. So now I feel like the shoulders are pretty much done. So I'm working down the pipeline into the elbows. When you're rotating and splining your upper arm, you really shouldn't focus on the wrist. The wrist is deceptive because the wrist is affected by the elbow controller. So when you're actually doing your splining and your blocking on your shoulder, you should actually be checking the curves on your elbow. So here you can see I've put a motion tread onto the elbow. I'm seeing how it is affected by the different controllers. And I realized here that actually I did do some bad blocking, that the rotation of the shoulder was a bit too extreme in one axis. And you may have heard the word gimbal lock, which isn't happening here, luckily. However, what is happening is the rotation order is changed slightly. So I wanted to try and keep my rotation simple, with having rotation Y be sort of back and forth, and my rotation Z be like in and out from the body. But because I rotated my controller in with the rotation X, that had kind of shifted the rotation order and the wrist, sorry, not the rotation order, it shifted the rotation axis. So I was struggling to animate just one curve. So for every movement, I had to animate 2 curves, which was a bit annoying. So I tried to reduce the amount of rotation in the X axis and then increase it in the Z axis. So it kind of counted each other out, and then I could just focus on the rotate Z for the inside and outside movement, so the drag and offset of the arm. Sometimes you have to rotate everything because it looks bad. But in this situation, I think it was okay to just focus on 2 of the rotations. Because like in the shoulder, the rotate X wasn't doing much for the shot, so I could reduce it quite a lot. So I'm pretty happy with the arm now. So now move down to the elbow. And I think my elbow was pretty good out of the gate, so I thought maybe look at the wrist first, because sometimes you have to go further down the pipeline to get something which makes sense in order to actually take a proper look at the higher up controller. If the wrist was completely broken, all my eyes would see was this broken wrist. So I had to focus a little bit on the wrist and build in the overlap, and then I could go back and check the elbow. But I do think that the elbow was pretty much fine. So the fact I'm on the wrist now means I'm pretty much near the end of spline, and in a way you could argue this is now polished, because the wrist is really the last thing that should be done in this type of shot, at least. So really looking at the overlap in the wrist and trying to get the wrist to like drag behind the arm, just like the arm drags behind the body. make sure the wrist drags behind the arm. You may have just seen that I was shifting the rotation X controller. I was seeing how it was affecting the shot, and I saw such a small change that I thought, well, set everything to 0, and nothing happened to my shot. So it's a good way of checking if you need to animate a curve. Set it to something really extreme within the range that you've animated, and see how much it's affecting your shot. And sometimes you have to animate it. You realize, oh, this is important, but this time I realized it wasn't. So with most rigs, they have what's called a master fist control. So I didn't want to animate all the fingers. And for characters with 5 fingers, or even more for aliens, it gets really tedious. So sometimes they have a inbuilt controller which you can open and close the fist. And it's not perfect, but it does give you a very quick, rough sort of overlap drag in the fingers. And for this type of shot, I think that's enough. I don't think I needed to do more. I mean, I could have spent another 45 minutes on this shot really looking at the hair and stuff. But polishing can go on forever, to be honest. And this was a practice assignment for me to do a quick workflow test. And that final 5%, which is important for feature production or, for maybe a really high quality piece of animation. And that's when you should spend the time. But for your practice shots, sometimes when you've got what you needed to learn out of the shot, you can move on to the next shot and apply what you've learned to something new. Because I could have spent another 50% of the entire animation time just on that last 5%, but I could have spent that energy on a new shot and learned something new or applied something new. So that's my sort of thought process on the idea. So making sure the settle feels nice at the end. Another thing that I did quite a lot, that was a mistake when I was sort of starting out, was I ended my sort of animation and I kind of assumed that the animation stopped, as in there was no more movement after the camera stopped rolling, which is obviously true for the production. However, in real life, of course, things move constantly, so you have to imagine where your character is going to be going, or where the force is, sort of what's affecting the character, even past the final frame. So for example, this is frame 70, which I'm finishing on, but I'm thinking in my head what's happening until frame 75, frame 80, and this is obviously a settle, so there's obviously very little movement, but even so, I want to imagine where would it happen. If I was to key frame 75, where would I key? And actually for most productions, they will ask you sometimes to key past the final frame and before the final frame, because pre-roll is quite important for simulations and stuff. So this is kind of near the very end of the shot now. I'm doing my head adjustments and maybe some head accents as well, just refining them. And I got a good piece of advice from a mentor that your audience sees the shot one time. So yes, you can spend hours doing it, but honestly, once you play Blast, and if you don't see anything, maybe on your very first viewing of your play Blast, so you just watch it one time. If nothing really stands out to you, then I guess you can say you're done. And this is what's happening here. I felt like I was done with the shot, so yeah, I was done. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the video and that it was useful. In my next video, I want to talk about maybe walk cycles and how to do something with lots of movement. But overall, this is something I use, this workflow, for most of my shots. And I think you don't have to copy it, but understanding the force and understanding your speed and timing and building in your layers of animation is, for me, the quickest way to get results. So hopefully it was useful, and hopefully I'll see you soon in the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.